In this lesson, we're going to talk about all of the technical things you need to know to be an IS auditor. Now, while it would be ideal if you had a Microsoft MCP, Network Plus certification, maybe a Cisco CCNA to have that technical background, we will cover everything you need to know at a high level and just deep enough so you understand all the technologies involved in information security. We're going to talk about cryptography and about physical and logical controls. We'll talk about environmental controls. We'll talk about network security. And we're also going to talk about just security policies and security design in general. So why don't we get started? First thing you need to be aware of is this concept called the CIA triangle. CIA for confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Now, what's the difference? You do need to know the distinction between confidentiality and integrity. In confidentiality, only the people or the processes that have the right and the need to be able to access that thing can get to it. In other words, if you don't have a need to know, or if this process has no reason to access that database, email, file, folder, printer, whatever it is, then it's not permitted. And we use confidentiality, we enforce it with something called authorization. So confidentiality only if you have a need to know. Now, generally, the military is more interested in confidentiality. On the other side, private sector is more interested in integrity, and it's not like they're not interested in the other, but this tends to be more their focus. With integrity, we guarantee that this piece of data, or this network transmission, or this whatever it is, has not changed in an unauthorized manner. We guarantee that this thing is still intact, whole, unmodified, untouched, not hacked, no timestamps changed, nothing. That it is the original as it was. That's integrity. How do we guarantee confidentiality and integrity? Well, there are many mechanisms, and we'll talk about those in greater detail. But in short, with confidentiality, we prove our identity, we authenticate, and then that whatever it is we're trying to get to, file, folder, printer, database, email, whatever that resource, that asset is, has an access control list. And when we try to get to it, we see whether or not our authentication, however we're logged on, has the right to get to it. So we have this concept of being authorized by an access control list. With integrity, we do something to make sure that this file has not changed. In an extreme case, we could encrypt a file to maintain its confidentiality. But for integrity, we don't necessarily need to be so much confidential as this thing has not been modified in an unauthorized way. So the very common thing we'll do is we'll use cryptography basically to protect it, but we'll do something called a hashing algorithm that we can use to run again to prove that the result now is the same as the result before, therefore this thing could not have possibly been changed. We'll explore cryptography and encryption and hashing in the next topic. So the idea of confidentiality, integrity, and then as a system administrator, as a network administrator, it's really crucial that we make things available. We make these resources, file, folder, printer, database, email, whatever this thing is, available to those who need it. Now, that might seem obvious, but sometimes you can overdo it with the confidentiality part. You can set an access control list or a level of access to be so restrictive that you accidentally leave out people who have a need, a legitimate need. So when we do the CIA triangle, we want to make sure that people who need access actually do get access, and they get it in a timely manner. That they don't have to be calling you up and say, I can't get into that thing again. That they actually can just go into it and get to it. And that the system and the network can provide it in a timely manner as well. We're always striving for that CIA triangle. So in terms of access control, This is the most common thing that we do in the private sector. We will have usually the operating system on a server, and you can see here in this slide that this server, there's a person who's accessing the server. The person proves their identity, and we'll talk about authentication schemes in greater detail. But you prove your identity either by password or biometrics or by holding some kind of device. And you prove that you are who you say you are. And your session, when you're on your desktop, you're given a session, and the session basically represents everything you do. And so that session allows you to connect to printers and files and folders and access your email and whatever. Part of that session is a token representing you and all of your access rights and all of the groups you belong to. So when you authenticate, you've got this token, and this all happens in the background. As a user, you don't see it. This is going on in the operating system itself. When you go to access a file or a folder, then that file or folder has an access control list on it. And the token is presented in the background to that access control list, and it could be share permissions, NTFS permissions, print permissions, or database permissions, email permissions, whatever. That process will check the identity of your token against the access control list, the ACL, to see what your level of authorization is. So this is this whole concept of access control. Different resources will have different access control lists. So I will log on as me, and I belong to maybe 3 or 5 different groups, and all those groups have different levels of privilege. This folder may allow me in its ACL, its access control list, to read, write, and execute. But that folder may only allow me to read because it depends upon the contents. And maybe this folder over here, I have no access whatsoever. So my token stays constant, but my allowed access depends upon what was set in the ACL on the resource I go to. Obviously, one of the things we have to watch out for in hacking is we're always trying to elevate our privilege above what our normal access is. And so we want to see, are people accessing things with a privilege level that they shouldn't have? Are they in the administrators group they shouldn't be in? Did they run some kind of hacking tool that temporarily elevates their privilege? So we're always looking out for that kind of thing. And we can talk later about reviewing logs to look for that kind of access. So access control is a big thing on our mind when we are setting network and server and system security. As we design security, there are a number of factors that we need to be conscious of. First of all, proving people's identification. And it's not just to the computer, but also in the building. I have a badge. I've got to swipe my badge before I walk in. Or people have to recognize me before I walk in. Or I have to punch in a code or have my voice recognized or something, or at least sign a book or something for my identity. And of course, it's only as good as how well you enforce it and how well you monitor it. So I prove my identification. I authenticate to a computer because my badge that gets me into a building is probably not going to be the same thing I use to authenticate to a computer. And then what am I authorized to get into? So as we design security, we're worried about general identification, people authenticating on systems, the level of authorization for each different resource. And not only that, but stuff slips through the cracks all the time. Like people are not getting into things they should be, or they're getting into things they should not be. So we should have some mechanism for logging all of the access. We should have some accounting and auditing. And all operating systems provide you the ability to set up auditing where you can see how people, who accessed, on what computer did they access, what time, what did they do. One of the things about when you look at audit logs is you can't always tell people's intent. Generally, I mean, the system only knows that this person at this time accessed this particular file and opened it and read it or changed it. Generally, it can't tell you what they did to change it or why they were in it in the first place. But at least you have the hard evidence that at least so-and-so's account actually got into it. Now, was that actually so-and-so? That's a whole other question. Because one of the big issues with security is, did somebody log in as somebody else, or did somebody spoof someone's identity and pretend to be somebody else and then access something? If I were a hacker, I would never be accessing things as myself. I would be pretending to be somebody else. So basically, it looks like someone else did it. But the auditing and the accounting is all part of your whole security design. So we need people to prove their identity. We need people to authenticate to systems. We need to have access control and authorization for all the resources. And we need to have audit logs and accounting so we can check to see what has been going on. And it may not just be looking for misdeeds. It could also be that you've got a department of people complaining that they can't get into this thing. Well, you can look at the audit log and see, yeah, 20 people yesterday tried to access and had access denied, and yet they had a legitimate need. Or we do the auditing just to see how much traffic is going to that thing, whatever that thing is, that file, folder, resource. So we can see whether or not it's actually in use or not. So the auditing and accounting isn't just for security, it's also for performance and to see if people can access what they need to access when they need to access it. The next thing we're going to talk about is security design and also basically checklists of what we need to be aware of when we are securing different parts of our network.